I needed to leave a couple of, right. Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to this CAPE lecture series. My name is Stephen Chu, I'm director. Today we are very honored to have the Professor Peter Robinson of the Computer Science Department to give a talk here. Professor Robinson is a professor of computer technology at the University of Cambridge. He is interested in new technologies to enhance communication between computers and their users, and the new applications to exploit these technologies. Early work involved the use of video and paper as a part of the user interface, leading to augmented reality. More recently, he has interested in the interference of the people's mental states from facial expressions, vocal nuances, body posture and gesture, and other physiological signals, and also considered the expression of emotions by robots and cartoon avatars. This has involved considerations of what it means to be human in an age of increasingly human-like machines. So hence the title of his talk is Of Machines and Men. Peter, please.
Thank you. So we'd love to have a picture. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. A bit curious, of course, with this way of meeting. I suppose we've got to know and love the webcam over the last few years, last 18 months. I've always felt rather pleased that it was one of my research students who invented the webcam. And I'm going to be talking a bit about how we can use cameras today. My interest, as nothing introduced, to do with interactions between people and machines. And one way we can learn about that is by studying the way that people communicate with each other. And noticeably, people do not communicate with each other just by using a keyboard and mouse. It's much nicer if we can meet face to face. If I had an audience in front of me, I could see if you were confused or understanding, interested or bored with what I was saying. And if you're lucky, I'd adapt what I was saying accordingly. Well, computers don't do that. And people who don't understand these social signals are people who have autism spectrum conditions. And arguably, in that sense, computers are autistic. And so some of our work over the past few years has been trying to see what we can do to address that. And that's led us to think a lot more about just general questions of what it means to be human as we give machines these human-like characteristics. Some people are beginning to get very nervous that the machines may actually take over. Maybe it's just the next step of evolution. Lots of famous people are very concerned about the way that robots, and they do tend to think of the machines as looking a bit like humans, are going to take over. And I want to explore that because not that I actually know much about robots, but over our work on human-machine interaction, we have learned quite a bit about people. And that turns out to be an interesting perspective on this. Well, you probably know the way that evolution has worked, and we've evolved to reach our current state. And there are those who think that the next step of that evolution will be into robots, and robots that will look like people, which is rather curious because it's not obvious that we're the ideal design. But what is it that robots don't have that people do have? What is it that I'm interested in? Well, it's this idea that we communicate through non-verbal channels, facial expressions, tone of voice, body posture and gesture. And these are all part of our communication. And there's actually a universal language of facial expressions and tones of voice. And it was something that interested Darwin. Maybe 10 years after he published his work on the origin of species, he also published a book on the expression of the emotions in man and animals, which was considering the possibility that there was a universal language of facial expressions that exposed a person's mental state to the people they were communicating with. And of course, Darwin thought that this might have some relevance. It would be of some evolutionary benefit if we could understand what someone was, if you like, thinking, their mental state, from their facial expression. And so he did a number of experiments to see if there was a universal language. Wasn't obvious. And these photographs, well, you see Darwin in the middle at the top, bottom left, his colleague, Guillaume Duchenne de Boulogne, who was working in Paris, and a page from Darwin's book on the expression of the emotions. And actually, it's quite interesting because it's one of the first scientific works to use photographs. And several of those photographs actually came from Duchenne in Paris. So in this little plate from the book, you see a picture of a girl, and with the hat, she is laughing. And in the other two, she is posing a smile. And actually, Duchenne noticed that these are different. When we are genuinely amused, there's a slightly different expression on the face from when we're just trying to look as if we're interested. And the pictures on the right are from Duchenne's collection. He took a lot of pictures of this man, actually a tramp off the streets of Paris, who he photographed in various emotional expressions. So the three there you see on the right, the one at the top shows a neutral expression. The one in the middle is a natural laugh. And in the bottom picture, Duchenne attached electrodes to his face to activate the muscles that would replicate the smile. I don't know if he was trying to see if that made him amused. It didn't, but it's a different sort of smile. Well, Duchenne had these photographs, and he sent a collection of them to Darwin in Cambridge. And Darwin used these to conduct an experiment to see if people recognized the same mental states. Now, these were full plate photographs, and we actually have Darwin's collection from Duchenne in the university library here. And if you ask very nicely, they'll show them to you. And Darwin used these for, well, a crowdsourced experiment, we'd call it nowadays. Crowdsourcing was a bit different in the 19th century. He invited people round to his country house for dinner, and over drinks beforehand, he'd pass around the photographs and ask people what emotion they perceived and put the answers into a spreadsheet. Well, of course, it wasn't a computer spreadsheet, it was a paper spreadsheet. We actually have these in the university library as well. And you can see there are rows in the spreadsheet for the different pictures that he was showing them, columns for the different people answering, and he fills in what expression they saw. And he saw there was a consensus view. Well, we actually repeated this experiment about 10 years ago now by digitizing the photographs that we had in the library and putting them on the internet and crowdsourcing in the modern sense. And we got about 20,000 people to label the emotions that they perceived in these 10 of the pictures. And you see two rows of labels under the pictures. The top row are the consensus labels that Darwin's guests identified, and the ones underneath are the ones from our larger crowdsourcing experiment. And you'll see that there's a consistency between them. Some of the language has changed a bit, laughter and happiness, and perhaps grief and fear. Well, that just says that these have similar facial expressions. But anyway, what it showed is that there is actually a universal language of facial expressions. And of course, we know that. We know that from other contexts, things like in the movies, people use their faces to express emotions. And it's a way of acknowledging the person you're talking to, telling them how you're feeling while talking about something. And the pictures here are actually of a Hollywood starlet called Florence Lawrence, who in 1909 was the Biography girl, very popular artist. And she was making something like 3 feature films a week, 3 films a week, a level of productivity you don't see in Hollywood today. And the reason was, of course, the films were quite short. You could only get about 20 minutes onto a roll of film. And they were silent films. She didn't have to learn her words. But the fact that they were silent meant that she did have to be able to express emotions. And this she could do through her face. And the pictures are actually an advertisement that she used to show the whole range of emotions that she could express. And actually, these are quite interesting. There are all sorts of things there. Although actually there's a pair, top left, bottom right. Top left is piety and bottom right is sadness. And actually, I think those are quite hard to distinguish. Now, that maybe says something about the morals of Hollywood starlets, even in 1909, piety and sadness are more or less the same thing, or it says there's something more to this. And of course, the answer is the latter. It turns out that it's not just the still picture that matters, the dynamics matter, the way that it changes over time. And we actually did some experiments to check that. Now, it has to be said, Darwin identified 7 or so emotions that you could identify in the face. And in the early 20th century, Darwin fell somewhat out of favor, and it was left to the American psychologist Paul Ekman in the 1960s, who revisited Darwin's work, perhaps did the tests a little bit more scientifically, using 6 emotions, which he called the basic emotions. These are ones that are very strongly expressed through the face. They're ones that are possibly important for survival, and therefore there's some evolutionary advantage to understanding them. And here we see them, and these are some pictures from Ekman's original paper on the work. And he did, as I say, more scientific studies. He actually circulated these photographs, because now photographs are rather cheaper than in Duchenne's day, so he could send packets of photographs off around the world and get people to label them and see if there was a consensus. And it turned out there was a pretty good consensus. And moreover, it transcended cultural and other boundaries around the world. So these were something that was a very basic part of human nature. And of course, it's still the case that these are important in films. And some of you may have seen the Disney film Inside Out, that came out about 5 years ago, where a young girl is portrayed living her life, and her emotions are actually played as active characters working inside the control room of her brain. And that's what you see here. And you see anger, and disgust and joy and fear and sadness, which are 5 of the basic emotions that Ekman had identified. The one that's missing is surprise, because you don't get surprises in Disney movies. And that has become quite a popular taxonomy for use in describing emotions. And my colleague, Simon Baron-Cohen, Professor Sir Simon Baron-Cohen, who runs the Autism Research Centre in Cambridge, has been interested in trying to understand why it is that some people, those with autism spectrum conditions, can't understand, can't see these expressions in the face. And to work on this, he did a a much more detailed analysis by actually looking at the Microsoft dictionary that does spell checking, and identified 1,100 words in it that described various emotions, and then worked out that amongst these there were about 400 different concepts, very finely divided concepts, and a lot of synonyms. And then he grouped the concepts into 24 larger groups. And they're interesting because what we see in these 24 groups are the 6 groups are the basic emotions that Ekman and Darwin had studied: fear, anger, disgust, happiness, sadness, and surprise. And they're the ones that you can recognize from still pictures. But the other 18 mental states are ones that are described as cognitive mental states. They describe what you're thinking. So they're things like bored or understanding, which I ought to be looking at to see if you're following the lecture, and so on. And arguably, these are the ones that are more important for human-machine interaction. So we became interested in seeing if we could identify these. And of course, the first thing was to see, well, what was it that characterized these? Now, the good news was that Simon Baron-Cohen, for his work, had been trying to work on possible intervention for children with high-functioning autism. So children with Asperger's who are very intelligent. They know they have a problem identifying these expressions in the face, and they're capable of doing something about it. And so Simon prepared a DVD with a huge corpus of video clips of actors acting these emotions. So there were the 400 very finely graduated mental states, and he recorded several videos of each, and then got a panel of 10 psychologists to say whether they were reasonable representations of the mental state that was being portrayed, and found 6 that had a strong agreement that this was a good representation for each of the 400 states. Produced this DVD with lots of games around it so that the children could learn the emotions, because they could play games, be played videos, and see if they could recognize them. And the answer was actually they got very good at recognizing the emotions on the DVD, less good at transferring that knowledge to new bits of video. So they had very good memories, but they couldn't generalize. And that was a rather peculiar thing. And Simon's more recent work had looked at how you can deal with that problem. And it turns out the context, it matters. If you don't just show the video, but you surround it with the story, then it becomes possible to recognize. But never mind, this DVD was fabulous training data for any machine learning system, because we had high quality video with well-agreed labels on it. And so we started doing experiments with it. One of the first ones we did was to see how long the video had to run for before people could recognize the mental state that was being portrayed. And so we did an experiment where we assembled videos showing the 6 basic emotions and 8 more showing the complex mental states. And sorry, it was 16 showing complex mental states, 8 showing the basic emotions, and then showed them to people and asked them if they could recognize. More than that, we took the video clips, which are typically 5 or 10 seconds long, and cut them down into shorter and shorter pieces. So we actually started by just showing about a quarter of a second, near enough a still picture, and then half a second, and then a second, and 2 seconds, and 4 seconds, and so on. And you see the results here. What happens is that the recognition rate for the basic emotions is the upper line in the bottom graph. In other words, pretty strong, about 75% recognition rate. This is on a 4-way forced choice, so the true depiction and 3 others, and we were getting a 75% recognition rate. But for the complex mental states, we noticed that the recognition rate increased as we went up to about 2 seconds. And after 2 seconds, it leveled off at very nearly the same recognition rate. So that was interesting. The recognition of complex mental states appears to require video rather than just showing still pictures. And so we built that into a system and ran it. You just point a camera at someone, a webcam, and do an analysis from the facial expression. We determine, well, features on the face, from those, the head pose, the tilt, whatever, and then identify features on the face and measure the dynamics of those features. And that helps us to recognize something called action units, which is a language that psychologists use when they're labeling video. And it's things like mouth open, mouth shut, head up, head down, whatever. And then combinations of those give us gestures. So nodding is a sequence of head up, head down actions. And then we can infer the mental state by combining some small number of these gestures over time. And here's a demonstration of the system working. This is a girl who was being asked to act as if she was agreeing. The bars on the left are showing you the gestures that are being picked up, and the graph at the bottom shows the probabilities of different mental states. And you can see there was a burst of red to start with when she was agreeing, and then actually she stopped and wondered if it had worked. So we see a burst of green when she's interested, a bit of blue as she concentrates, and then a bit more red. And if we watch it again, we'll see after 2 seconds, she's agreeing. The nodding while smiling is a very strong indication of agreement. And then she paused, so it, signal drops away. Oh, do a bit more, righto, concentrates and does a little bit more agreeing, and we pick it up. And that was a system that was built 15 years ago now, and seemed to be really quite good, at least for, we worked with a set of mental states that we thought would be useful for computer interaction. So these are things like agreeing, concentrating, disagreeing, interest, thinking, and uncertainty, that the person's uncertain. And each of these is populated with 5 or 10 of those 400 elementary mental states. And we see that there's a confusion matrix here, and there's quite a strong diagonal. We're getting a very strong recognition for concentrating, and rather weaker for thinking, the blue column of thinking. And that's, if we look at the confusions, when we show a video that was meant to be thinking, we're seeing that people are seeing concentrating or interest or uncertainty, which are all fairly reasonable confusions. So this looks quite promising, and led us to do more work. And there's another psychologist, Jim Russell, working in Vancouver, who had wondered whether, rather than using words, you could use numbers to describe mental states. And he got people to do, well, a sort of principal component analysis, really. They got words for various mental states from this taxonomy and spread them out on a desk with similar ones together and different ones apart. And what you end up with is a multi-dimensional diagram, but the first 2 dimensions are particularly interesting. And you see them here. The horizontal axis is something that psychologists call valence, and it's going from negative emotions like depression, gloominess on the left, across to positive emotions like happiness and content on the right. The vertical axis is perhaps a little harder to perceive, but it's something that we call arousal, and it's going from very passive at the bottom, so a sort of fairly neutral valence, but passive action would be sleepy or bored, and a more active one might be alarmed, slightly negative, or excited, slightly positive. So you can sort of pick out numbers that in these 2 dimensions. And it turns out that these 2 dimensions account for about half the variance in the analysis of the words. So there are further dimensions that you can think of. Potency, is it a weak or strong emotion? Tendency, is it inward or outward sense? And so on. And so we more recently built a system that uses this. This is with a different face tracker. So again, identifying the face, there are various more modern techniques. Computers have got more powerful in the meantime. And so we can analyze again, and we're picking out the action units now in the histograms at the bottom. And as the person animates their face, we're seeing some of these words like happiness being picked out, and also a trace in the 2-dimensional valence arousal space, showing us that sort of analysis of the data. And this is all done by machine learning, of course. The trouble is this 2-dimensional model is a little limited. And if you actually take a large collection of videos, carefully acted, carefully labeled, and then analyze them, what you find is that if you look at the prediction intervals, if you like, the 95% confidence limits, they overlap significantly. So fear, anger, disgust, and sadness, these are 4 of Ekman's 6 basic emotions, are essentially indistinguishable in the valence arousal space. They're both slightly negative valence and not terribly aroused. You can then go to surprise, which is typically a slightly positive, and happiness, which is more positive and indeed can show more activation as well. And that maybe tells us something, that the facial expression is quite good for detecting valence, the degree of happiness. And in fact, the student who did this work has set up a really quite successful business selling software that does this. Her company is called Affectiva, recently incorporated into another company, and it essentially detects valence, and it does it successfully. They've used this for things like evaluating drafts of commercials, and also for monitoring car drivers, becoming very important to monitor car drivers as cars get more automatic. And I've spoken at CAPE before about the work we've done with Jaguar Land Rover on that sort of analysis, trying to understand if the drivers are confused, in which case you might need to remove distractions, or if they're concentrating again, or if they're falling asleep, which in a modern semi-automatic car matters if you need to get their control back on the wheel. So that turns out to be quite important, and a lot of that can be done just by looking at the valence alone. And we've also done more work with Simon Marin-Cohen, looking at ways that we could help children with autism spectrum conditions learn about emotions. And one way they can do it is by acting them themselves. And so he's produced another, and we had a big European project actually, where we had videos that the children had to enact as a way of learning how to recognize the mental states. And also we monitored things like the voice, so the pitch, the energy, the tempo of the voice, and also the body gestures and so on, and give them feedback. We worked on the facial expression bit here, and what you see is one of the videos, top left, somebody acting it, and then feedback, roughly speaking, which of the actions in the face need more or less emphasis in order to more closely follow the DVD. So that's been quite successful, and it turns out that this, when Darwin wrote his book was on the expression of the emotions in man and animals. He was interested in whether animals had a similar language, and he looked particularly at dogs and cats. Here you see a dog and a cat at the top left, prepared to fight, and at the bottom right, in an affectionate frame of mind, as Darwin puts it. So animals can express this through their body posture and gestures, and to some extent through their facial expressions. Horses can express it through their facial expressions, and Darwin studied that. Well, with our colleagues across what used to be a field and is now the new physics department, they were interested in measuring pain in a different species, in sheep. And so they'd been working on ways that you could characterize pain in sheep. And there are various ways. Sheep have very expressive faces, it turns out. So if they're in pain, their eyes narrow and pull back, their cheeks draw in, their ears fold down, their lips pull back, and their nostrils move from a sort of shallow U shape to a sharper V shape. And some of these, the eyes, the mouth, the ears, are things that we can actually track using a version of our face tracking procedure. We just had to retrain it on some different data so that it could track a sheep face instead of a human face, and then apply the same sort of techniques using some label data. And in fact, one of my other research students did some work on this and very bravely went and took this system to a farm run by a man called Adam Henson, which appears on a BBC program. Have an effect on it. Well, of course, that's all the nonsense. But people do endow machines with personalities. And there's a very popular robot that's used quite a lot in schools for various sorts of things called the Now robot, which has a head that's solid plastic. It has LEDs for eyes, a hole for a mouth, and yet people think of it as if it's got emotions, whereas it doesn't. All of its facial expressions are absolutely constant. And this is an extraordinary thing. If you put one of these little robots, they're only a couple of feet tall, into a room, people will immediately warm to it. And I think it's because they think it's a child, because it's small and it's got a face. I mean, obviously not a real face. And so this made us wonder, well, can we make people more attracted to machines if we give them facial expressions that actually react? And the cheapest robot that we could lay our hands on that could express emotions was actually a robot, a chimpanzee, which has 4 motors in its face that allows it to smile. And we did a small experiment where we got people to have a conversation with this thing, which is fairly obviously not a person. And we either got the robot to react in some way to what they were saying, or just to make random movements. And they thought it was listening more if it made appropriate movements. So people actually thought it was paying them attention, even though it was patently not even alive, still less a person. So that made us then wonder, well, how realistic has the robot got to be? And so we got some video clips of various sorts of machine being abused, from a automatic vacuum cleaner through a sort of humanoid robot to a more realistic android to a human. And people empathized with them more, the more human they looked. they felt sorrier for them. They'd want to save them from the situations that were being depicted in the movie clips. So we thought, well, that's interesting. We'll let's make a really realistic robotic head and see how people react to it. So we went to David Hanson in America, who is an expert at making these sort of robots. And he built for us the robot that you see on the right there, modeled on Charles Babbage, another Charles, and inside the head there are 24 motors that replicate the main muscle groups in the face, and this allows us to show a remarkable range of expressions. And you can see from these pictures just the range of expressions. And David Hanson is actually very good at prosthetics, so it's really surprisingly realistic, especially when you put a wig on it and dress it up in a shirt. And we were then interested in seeing whether people reacted to it, or how they reacted to having a conversation with something that could really replicate human facial expressions. This is from a video we made for a slightly different purpose, but you can sort of see the way that it works. This was actually to see, well, the story we're telling was actually meant as a joke. It's saying, why not have a robot as your satellite navigation system, and it could have a proper conversation with you. It happened to make for a good movie. And you can see us driving and having a conversation with a fairly realistic looking robot. Although probably you can already see that actually the dynamics of the facial expression are unconvincing. Actually, they're not so much unconvincing as downright wrong. And when we started doing our experiments with people having a conversation with it, they just thought it was creepy. This is not a successful experiment. The one thing we did do with it that was of some scientific value was some work with training medical students. There's a medical condition called dystonia, where people find that they can they make uncontrollable spasms, particularly in the facial muscles. And when medical students first encounter a patient with this condition, they often show disgust, and that's not a good idea. You don't want medical students showing disgust when they meet a patient. So we thought, oh, well, we have a robot. What we would do, we got a man with dystonia who very kindly came in, allowed us to film him, and then we ran our face tracker and replayed the actions on the robot. And so we took a group of medical students who then had a conversation with the robot as it replicated dystonia. And it turned out the one thing our robot was good at was making uncontrollable muscle movements. And then observed them when they met a real patient, and they were much better able to conceal their immediate reaction. And we had a control group who didn't have the prior conversation with the robot, and they displayed the sort of reactions that we'd seen previously, a sort of disgust. So this almost was a success, except it turned out we had a third group to whom we just showed the videos that we'd recorded, and if they'd seen those, they were just as well able to control their mental state. So actually this robot was extremely expensive and virtually useless scientifically. However, it did turn out to be very useful for other reasons. And the main one was, if you have a robot, that robotic head looks like a person and it can express emotions, the press will beat a path to your door. So we did endless television interviews. And I think my favorite was when we were invited to appear on a chat show in Spain. So here you see me and one of my postdocs. This was a program that goes out 4 nights a week in Spain called El Hormiguero, which it's a 50-minute program, and it includes a 5-minute science spot in the middle every day. So it's sort of the equivalent of Graham Norton's show, really. The young lady you see there is some film starlet or other, but they still try and show science in the middle of it. And they thought that our robot would be good. And we'd just written a little program, so the use the face tracking system and then replay it live. So you can see that we're tracking my facial expressions in this case, and then replaying them directly on the robot. So if I tilt my head one way or the other, the robot follows at some rate. I mean, actually, when we proposed doing this, my colleague said, well, you've got an experimental face tracker, an unreliable robot, and live television. What could possibly go wrong? The answer is actually it worked perfectly, rather to my surprise. More interestingly, the presenter of the show, after 2 minutes rehearsal in the afternoon, worked out what would go well on the robot. So slow movements and exaggerated. And of course, it all looked terrifically impressive. I can't say how grateful I was to him that he actually was sufficiently sharp to realize what would look good and incidentally to want to make it look good. So that was great fun. We had an outing to Madrid, but also interesting because it tells us what people think about machines. When I display this, they always want me to say what it's feeling. Does it have feelings? Well, of course, the answer is no, it's a simulation. But people are fascinated by machines that look a bit like people. And this goes back a long way. Back in the deep history of Buddhist religion, 400 BC, they had precious metal people. And the 7th century Buddhist scholar Dazan described humanoid automata made from metals that could recite sacred texts. And so on. These are continued through history. And this is a 16th century robotic monk. And it powered by clockwork, runs along the floor, and the head glances left and right, the mouth moves as if it's saying prayers, the eyes look towards the cross in its hand, which it raises every so often, and so on. And people thought this maybe had some spirit to it. It's just a clockwork motor. So this is a very curious thing. Why do people endow machines with human characteristics? And again, this goes back a long way in fiction. It goes back to the ancient Jewish golem mythology, where you make a man of clay and it somehow comes to life and incidentally turns on you, or Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's the 1910 Charles Ogle version of the film, again, turns on its creator. And interestingly, particularly this year, Karel Čapek's play, Rossum's Universal Robots, which came out in 1921, which was actually the play that, or the work that popularized the use of the word robot to mean a humanoid automaton. Until then, a robot had just meant automatic, and it was used in Czechoslovakia for traffic lights, which were robot policemen, but this was a robot person. And Čapek was interested in these robots, which incidentally became sentient, turned on their owners in the way of robots in films. But he's actually very interested in the question of how the robots realize that they're missing something that the humans have, and they don't know what it is. And they, towards the end of the play, try and dissect the humans to try and find out. But it's interesting, we have this constant story in films, and it's carried on in later films, in Fritz Lang's Metropolis, particularly in Asimov's robot stories, and perhaps famously in 2001, that robots somehow become sentient, independent, take over, usually ending badly for the humans. And perhaps the only favorable depiction of a robot is with Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where the robot is your plastic pal who's fun to be with. But we still think of them as, by and large, as humanoid. These, I would say, are much more of a concern. And of course, the military are interested in robots. They use them to do dangerous things. Well, the military do a lot of dangerous things, so they like a lot of robots. And increasingly, they're beginning to think in terms of using autonomous weapons. I don't believe there's much evidence that they've been used yet, but they would like to get the human out of the loop entirely and just send a robot, probably an aerial drone of some sort, that could identify targets and would take a decision as to whether that was a legitimate target or not. And given the inability of the military to do this with human operators, one does worry somewhat about the idea of automating it. And then, of course, there are domestic robots. So yes, there are vacuum cleaners. The Japanese love robots, so they have robot waiters in cafes. Actually, that's not such a stupid idea, because this gives people who are housebound the ability to work, because they can remotely control the robot and actually interact with people. So actually, that it's not an autonomous robot, but a remotely controlled robot in a cafe can turn out to be quite a useful thing. And because their obsession with robots, they'll even have robotic monks that can perform wedding ceremonies. And there are other things that people are getting worried about, so robots that will... The first uses for any technology are usually pornography and gambling, and it turns out that sex robots are arriving. So what does this tell us about these machines? What are the things that we need to be worrying about as we, as technologists, put them together? And it's perhaps helpful to lump this together under the general heading of artificial intelligence. Now, actually, artificial intelligence probably doesn't really mean anything. Most people who use the phrase artificial intelligence are actually just trying to sell you something. It's a marketing phrase. This is clever. Or they're scaremongering, like the headlines I showed at the beginning. Artificial intelligence is going to take over the world. Probably the best definition from at least a computer science point of view is it's something that we'd like to do, but we don't know how to do it yet. And we call that artificial intelligence. And then when we can do it, we call it facial expression analysis or automatic language translation or fraud detection for credit cards, or all of these sorts of things, or indeed, most recently, working out protein folding structures, which is an interesting problem, terribly important if you're doing drug design, and it's one that Demis Hassabis and his team at DeepMind actually seem to have solved. So Nobel Prize there, no doubt, at some point. And of course, we're seeing it permeating through into real life. So perhaps a better definition of artificial intelligence is a machine that performs some sort of cognitive process like a person. And it's probably going to be using machine learning nowadays. So you gather some large body of real world data, you use statistical analysis to build a mathematical model of it, and then you can use that to analyze incoming data and predict the responses of a system to unseen stimuli. And of course, this is important for things like self-driving cars. Although if the training data omits cyclists and pedestrians, the cars are likely to react badly with them. Or if the training data omits snow and rain, there are a lot of problems. And it all depends on the quality of the large collection of real world data. If you're trying to study people, you need to collect lots of data about people. But that's exactly what the social media companies do. They want to sell you advertising. And to do that, they need to know what interests you, because those are the advertisements you'll click on. So they're trying to understand your preferences. And also they're trying to understand, that gives you engagement, which means that you use the social media more. And so you see more advertisements and the company harvests more money. And they also want to understand your social networks, because that way they can draw your friends into the network, and that gives them growth, and it's more people watching, more advertisements, meaning more revenue. So we need to worry a bit about artificial intelligence, quality of the training data, but also perhaps the motivation of the people doing it. Arguably, Facebook are really rather good at this. One might just question why they're doing it. And of course, there are other definitions of artificial intelligence, I suppose, most famously Turing and the Turing test, which is a very curious idea if you think about it. I mean, you've got these three participants, and it talks about the sorts of things that Turing thought a computer would be good at, like arithmetic and chess, but also the things that he thought characterized people, like poetry. But it was all done by teletype, so there's no facial expressions, no vocal nuances, no body posture and gesture. It's as if he had a very technological idea of what interactions between people were. They ignored all of these social signals. And anyway, perhaps asking the question, can a machine think, is a pretty silly question. I mean, it's sort of the same question as, can a submarine swim? It's a type error. It's just not the sort of question that's worth asking. And interesting, when Turing first wrote this paper, which a lot of people think nowadays was rather important, the director of the National Physical Laboratory, where he was working at the time, was a man called Charles Darwin, the grandson of the other Charles Darwin. And Darwin looked at this paper and dismissed it as a schoolboy essay and not worth going out with the name of the National Physical Laboratory on it. Perhaps Darwin had more sense than Turing. And of course, there are other things that people ask about, like, will we become machines? There are people who actually think that there's an evolutionary step. So Steve Mann at MIT pioneered this idea back, getting on for 20 years ago now, wearing a head-up display, armed with cameras, instrumenting his life and seeing virtual or augmented reality on top of it. And of course, the Google glasses were a notable failure in that realm. And people talk about doing a memory dump and having a memory transplant. And Kevin Warwick likes to think of himself as a bionic man because he implants chips that monitor muscle contractions and can transmit the sensation to his wife. So they're sort of electronically linked. Well, that's not, frankly, really being bionic. The sort of thing that makes you transhuman is maybe having a synthetic artificial leg or hearing aid or pacemaker. These are the sorts of things that actually matter, but they're not exactly going to a step of evolution. It's sort of a temporary patch for repair. So the question remains, why are we so fascinated by robots? Why do we think that they're going to, well, why do we think they look like people? Because they're such a poor representation physically. And why do we think they even like us? There's no relationship, there's no social signaling, no understanding. I mean, even if it does recognize and display emotions that we can sort of do a bit, that's not the same as actually feeling empathy. It's a simulation. And people don't seem to understand the difference between a simulation and the real thing when it comes to dealing with robots. And of course, there's absolutely no spiritual representation, which you could argue would be more important. So maybe what we're seeing is that there's some sort of psychological confusion, and maybe it's just the thing of the day. The modernists wanted to explain humans as intelligent machines, because back in the Victorian times, when the steam engine took off, people explained people as if they were steam engines. They talked about the mechanics. And now the big technology of the age is computing. So we try and explain people as if they were computers. But that's just to reduce humanity to the mechanical. And perhaps also this curious thing that we wish to imprint humanity on machines. So we look from a human viewpoint, and that's what we see. We impose humanity on the machine, which just simply isn't there. It is just a machine, and we can just turn it off when we're bored with it, which we, so far at least, don't do with people. So I think there are important ethical implications here that technologists need to be aware of. Machines can sense emotions and express emotions, but that's not the same as experiencing emotions. If you like, having sensor systems and servos doesn't give us sentience. And if we try and think of these machines as people, it's a category error. It's just a non-question. And actually, there are important ethical issues, and I'd say they're there in the embedded system in the world around us. They're there in things like social media. They're certainly there in autonomous weapons. And they're just the usual questions that any profession has to address. And that is, what's the motivation of the practitioners? And the motivation of the stock market traders and of Facebook is pretty weak, frankly. They want to make money. In the case of the stock market, they weren't particularly competent. In the case of Facebook, they're frighteningly competent. In the case of things like autonomous cars, motivation is perhaps rather better. There is a safety argument. But again, the competence one has to then wonder about, because they don't understand the complexities of real driving. They don't gather enough of the right sort of training data. So what I hope I've been saying is that we've done this huge amount of work on machines and trying to make them have human characteristics, understanding emotions, displaying them. But it's important to understand that the machines aren't human. They are just machines, but that we as professionals do have responsibilities, and they're just the same as the responsibilities in any profession. But perhaps that would be a good time to take questions. I'll just mention that, of course, I don't do any of the work here. It's all done by incredibly clever young people, and there's a few of them being shown here. They're the ones who actually have the ideas and do the work. And I just come here and talk about it, which is very enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. This is a wonderful, excellent talk. And I think it prompted for many questions, I'm sure. Now the floor is open. So any questions? So you can either raise your hand or just switch on your microphone. I can see, Michael, you already unmute. Do you like to ask a few questions?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Professor Chu. Thank you, Professor Robinson, for such a good talk. I have a question, and it's something which I'm not sure you mentioned, but I was reminded of it by some of the comment. And it's around this whole business we hear these days of the micro emotions. And by that, I mean the transient emotions where someone may exhibit a facial expression for perhaps a few hundred milliseconds at the most and then change it. And this is maybe linked to their social conditioning and forcing them to change it to something that may be more acceptable to the other person, or they're trying to manage their emotions, or it may be linked to the concept of veto, where psychological actions are often more vetoed than they are commenced. So can you comment on that and how that fits into the interaction with machines?
Yes, yes. So I suppose this takes us back to Duchenne's work, and of course, famously the Duchenne smile that I spoke about, where if you're genuinely amused, there are some muscles by the eye that contract, which you can't consciously control. They're only controlled subconsciously. And so this is, if you like, a way of telling whether somebody is genuinely amused or not. And it's only with more recent technology that these micro expressions have become more interesting, possible to study them. And actually it was Paul Ekman again who first did work on this. And you, as you say, you get these expressions, they last perhaps 10, 20 milliseconds, a few milliseconds. And there's a suspicion that they betray the real feeling when somebody is dissembling. And Ekman would say that you can see these in the videos of Bill Clinton, when he says of Monica Lewinsky, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, and also of O.J. Simpson on trial, that either there's minute flashes that just show that he wasn't being entirely honest. And Ekman has published on this and actually now does a healthy business training people from the Transportation Security Administration in America, who are the people who interview you. Typically, as you're trying to get out of the country, actually, before you're allowed onto a flight, they're looking to see if you're acting suspiciously, and they're looking for these motions in the face. And there's been very little scientific work to explain it, or to even see if it works. So Ekman famously has not published any scientific results on micro-expressions. Now people have, there's a group at Oulu in Finland who did some very good work using, these expressions are just about last long enough that you can pick them up with a standard 50 Hertz camera, so just over 20 milliseconds. And so they looked for these and tried to see if they could detect deception. And they reported that they could, but the trouble is it's really very hard to do experiments on detecting in deception because you've got to make the stakes high. And it's really hard to get ethical approval for an experiment where you're going to electrocute the participant if they fail to dissemble. So you've got to make them tense. And the way you do this actually, that does get ethical approval, is to say that you'll withhold payment if they fail to act the dissembling. So they really have got to act as if they are, and they know that if they get it wrong, it's going to cost them money. Actually, of course, you naturally pay everybody afterwards anyway. That's a requirement for most ethical experiments. And it's just not tested, I think. It's very hard to get good data on this. There's better work that's been done. If you look at the statistics of lie detection, of course, things like the polygraph is well known to be just security theatre. You wire somebody up with lots of wires to a machine with pens going trace, trace, trace. They're terrified, so they tell you the truth. And it's reasonable, well, or they're terrified, so their heart rate increases, which doesn't really mean that it tells you anything. So that's a pretty useless technique. And if you look at the statistics, the police are actually quite good at detecting when someone's lying. The security services in the UK, at least, are extremely good, by which I mean they're sort of 2/3 accurate rather than 50-50. Micro expressions doesn't seem to get you anywhere. So there is something that humans can see. And I don't know if you've ever passed through Israel onto a flight there, the way you're questioned, there is, of course, a skill to informally interrogating someone that helps you see if they're trying to hide something. And I think that's more what Ekman is training people to do, rather than actually spotting micro-expressions. So I think micro-expressions, they exist, but quite what they reveal is another matter. And that was to be an interesting question, and it would be fun to actually be able to address it properly.
Oh, thank you very much. That's interesting. Reminded me that we've all got high-speed cameras in our pockets. My phone will
Yes.
do 7680 frames a second, so it should be easy for get a student project here maybe as well. Thanks, Vita.
I think that's a thought. Yeah, maybe some student might be interested to investigate it. Yeah, and maybe from Peter's camp can apply for a Cape Copper Award and spend 6 months to study it. Because I think we're talking a lot about the emotions is more often the concept of being static, and is this dynamic things which people know very little about, and I think, yeah, could look.
Yes, well, I think, of course, a lie detector would be has a great appeal to people, and it would be great if you could make one, but it seems it's more complicated than you might think. And of course, a lot of the work we've done has used training data that was acted. And when we tested, the video clip I showed you was somebody being asked to act as if they were agreeing. So actually getting training data that shows people in real world situations is even harder, not least because most of the time, and we did do a lot of experiments on car drivers where we monitored them for long car drives, and they just have a neutral expression over 95% of the time. So actually, there's nothing to see most of the time. And one of the things we had to do was to devise an algorithm that detected, as it were, emotional silence, so a neutral expression. And only if there was some expression did we then try and classify it. So if you're trying to gather natural data, it's a very slow business because you're having to video people for hours and hours. And then you've got to label it, and you've got to get high quality labeling, and the sort of people, trained psychologists who can label video are expensive. So it's just a huge job. One of the beauties of working with sheep turned out to be that if we're trying to analyze sheep facial expressions, we've got a lot of sheep in a natural environment, actually out on the West Cambridge site, so we can go and film them. And what's more, if we're only looking for pain, we know whether they're in pain or not. We don't have to administer pain to them, because in a well-managed flock of sheep, even in a well-managed flock, there'll be 5% of the sheep will have some problem, foot rot, mastitis, something like that, and they'll be in pain. But their medical records, which are kept independently, know that. So actually, when we photograph the sheep, we know which ones are probably in pain. So actually, we have rather well-labeled training data, which we can gather very quickly. It's rather harder with people to evoke a whole range of emotions. To some extent, you can evoke positive and negative valence emotions by showing them happy or sad films, but it doesn't work with all people. And we can't administer pain, that really is considered bad form, and so on. It's really very hard to get natural data. So, and even if we could get natural data and train the systems using natural data, there is a question, what do you do if you come up against a method actor who actually genuinely feels pain because they've learned how to build that emotion within themselves, and then their expression of it is more natural? Really interesting and difficult problems.
I agree absolutely, but I think you mentioned there are a couple of different things. One is how to get emotion recorded while a long time has no other facial expression. You need to be able to sort of normalize, standardize the face and detect the changes, meaningful changes. And the other thing you mentioned is study getting close to human as ethical things, and it's difficult to do, and even for animals.
Yes, yes. Well, arguably in the UK, animals are more protected than humans, but fortunately that didn't bother us.
So that's but nevertheless, you're talking about have a certain way, so for example, if you get a permission in the hospital or whatever, no people coming to the A&E or whatever have a certain kind of pain or whatever. But I think it is a long shot on this. I think the final thing you mentioned is really how you can meaningfully study or distinguish before people playing or the people really undergo certain emotion. I think that's where you mentioned the subconscious control and the micro emotion. I think you need the people have experience or at least test that hypothesis, because currently, as you mentioned, very little study has been done. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I see a couple of questions have come up in the chat, so I might just address one of those.
Sure.
Because someone has asked about, Irfan Abbas has asked whether artificial intelligence might help autistic children recognize human emotions. And that's a very interesting question, because that was actually the way this started. I had this very bright research student, Rana El-Kalioubi, who was trying to analyze mental states from video. And she was giving a talk to our research group about what she'd been doing. And in fact, it was one of the other research students who had a brother who was autistic who drew her attention to the fact that this was related to autism. And that's what actually then sent her off to talk to Simon Baron-Cohen, and very productive that was too. And yes, we did ponder at the time about, indeed wrote a paper about the possibility that something you might call an emotional hearing aid. And this was back in the mid-2000s, so about 2005-06, we wrote a paper about the emotional hearing aid, purely speculative, wondering if you could have a camera that a child with autism could have a camera mounted on their glasses. We speculated, this was long before Google Glasses or anything like that, and it could monitor the people that they were talking to, and perhaps through audio feedback warn them if they were getting frustrated with the conversation or angry, and it seemed quite possible. We couldn't actually find any cameras the right form factor for this, and so we had other things to worry about, actually just getting the system to work at all. But yes, the idea of an emotional hearing aid is an interesting one. Again, when we published this, the press loved it. Well, I think we still have somewhere the newspaper clipping from the Daily Mail, which titled this the borometer, and it was suggesting this is the sort of thing that you need in a meeting to see if you're boring the audience. So you would wear this and it would tell you if your audience was bored in a meeting. All right, that's one way of tackling it. Now, there's a delicate question here. Some people with high functioning autism actually value their autism. Like Greta Thunberg, they regard it as their superpower. And actually, you've got to be very careful about saying, we can treat that, we can fix it, because that's a technologist coming in and assuming that they know better than the actual person what they want. So absolutely, first question, is this a form of intervention, assistance that the individual wants? And then, yes, you could imagine an artificial intelligence system, as the question envisages, that would just monitor and give feedback. I think on the whole, for somebody who simply wants to learn about it, teaching systems are the better way to go. So that's what we did with our ASC inclusion project, trying to teach people how to recognize mental states by essentially by acting them and then giving them feedback on the quality of the acting. And then Simon Baron-Cohen's done other work with, for those of you who know children's television, you may know there's a television series called Thomas the Tank Engine, about engines that sort of have personalities. And Simon made a similar series, but absolutely not modeled on Thomas the Tank Engine at all. That would be improper from copyright points, which featured trains and mechanical devices that actually had real people's faces matted in on the front that could show the expressions that we've been trying to analyze. And so actually children with Asperger's like things that are regular. So trains on lines is a good thing. And if a train falls off the line, they empathize with it. And so they learn to recognize that from the context, how to interpret the facial expressions. And that actually turned out to be a much better tool than just showing lots of video recordings of individuals acting emotions. So there are ways you can help. This sort of adventure game was one. Another thing, perhaps a better way, is there are interventions for children with autism spectrum conditions, but the important thing is to introduce them very early. And that means early diagnosis is crucial, but you can't do most of the conventional tests for autism spectrum conditions until age about 2 or 3, but you'd really like the intervention earlier than that. And again, Simon did a fabulous experiment where he detected that children 1 day old could distinguish pictures of people from pictures of machines. And by doing a long-term study, he could also see which they preferred to look at, which they smiled when they were shown. And it turns out that if they prefer looking at machines, it probably means they're somewhere more on the autism spectrum. So at birth, more or less, children, you can detect whether a child has this latent condition, and you can detect it. This is weeks before they can even recognize their mother. You can actually see their eye movement patterns. And we were very keen to do a long-term study. I mean, it would have to be a very long-term study. We'd need to monitor, roughly speaking, every child born in Cambridge for a year. That's a lot of children, and then follow them for 2 or 3 years to see if we could make a detection system. So it's going to be a huge project, and it's one of those wonderful grant application that you put in, and we got 2 reviews back, one of which said, "Don't be stupid, this is impossible," and the other one said, "Don't be stupid, this has already been done." And the referee, the panel then said, well, both of them said this is stupid, so they didn't fund it. They didn't notice that the 2 referees said completely different things. And it arguably is quite a useful technique. So I think techniques like that are really quite useful. So for diagnosis, particularly early diagnosis, could be very helpful. Oh, I see. Sorry, more other questions come in. Okay, I'm not sure that I entirely understand this question about linguistics. And again, by monitoring conversation, you can detect a difference between neurotypical and neurodivergent, typically people with autism spectrum conditions. And maybe you can use that to make an analysis. Fascinating. I confess I don't know that much about linguistics, so I won't pretend to talk about it. But yes, I think that's an interesting idea. And of course, now speech recognition is sufficiently accurate that you can very rapidly turn the signals of the speech waveform into symbols for analysis, and then all our language processing tools can be brought to bear on it. So yes, I think that's a very interesting possibility.
Yeah, I think so. I think now the speech recognition and even comprehension has been developed so much. And I think there is a possibility probably to further extend this and then try to cross over hybrid with what you develop on the facial and the emotion expression and combine them together. I think there's need some more studies, more actions. Yeah, people can do that. Right. Any further questions? If it's not, let's thank Professor Robinson again for this wonderful talk. And thank you very much for attending this lecture series. Thank you. Have a very good day.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.